Hi, this is the new MPC Studio Mark II, a hardware controller for the MPC software running on a PC or a Mac, meaning that it doesn't do anything on its own, but rather gives you hardware access to many of the features of the MPC software. MPC Studio is designed to give you the best of both worlds, the hands-on control of hardware alongside as much storage and I/O and as many plugins as you have on your computer. In this video, I'll give you an overview of what it can do, give you a quick look at the MPC workflow overall, and also compare MPC Studio Mark II to its standalone brother, the MPC-1, and its main competitor, the Maschine Mikro. Before I start, a quick disclosure. Akai sent MPC Studio over for review, but reviews are never paid, and Akai has no say over the content of this video. This channel is funded by people who subscribe to my content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of what you choose to buy. Let's start with an overview. Hardware controllers for the MPC software aren't a new thing. Akai has previously released, among other, the MPC Touch controller, which had a screen and audio interface, MPC Studio Black, which was less expensive than MPC Touch and had a fairly large LCD screen too. This newest MPC Studio Mark II is Akai's attempt to reduce the cost of entry into the MPC platform even further by removing the large screen and additional encoders in favor of a workflow which assumes that you have a computer nearby and may as well use its screen. The MPC Studio Mark II still gives you full-size velocity and pressure sensitive pads, adds a new touch strip, which does a bunch of things, among other replace the Q-Link knobs on previous models, and pulls off a few new tricks of its own, which we'll talk about in a bit. And MPC Studio Mark II has even more buttons than the MPC-1, giving you even more direct control over things you didn't have dedicated buttons for previously. MPC Studio has a very small high-resolution screen that's designed mostly to give you access to one parameter at a time, so it's not that bad that it's relatively small, and you definitely need to have a screen nearby for a lot of things beyond what this controls directly. That said, despite the fact that this doesn't have a touchscreen like its standalone brother, you can get pretty far just by using these controls and rarely end up reaching for a mouse, though you do need it for a few things. You can't do everything using the controller. In terms of connectivity, there's not much. MPC Studio connects to your computer and is powered over USB, and it also has TRS MIDI in and out to control external hardware gear, or if you want to connect a keyboard to it. So it can act as a MIDI interface, but not as an audio interface. There's no audio inputs and outputs. It works just fine using a computer without an audio interface. As long as it's strong enough, you can reduce the buffer size and get very low latency. However, if you want to sample or want multiple inputs and outputs, you'll want to pair this with an audio interface plugged into your computer. So that's it for the overview. Let's dive deeper into the workflow. The MPC software is basically a simplified digital audio workstation, but unlike other DAWs like Pro Tools, Cubase, Logic, or even Ableton Live, which were primarily designed to be used using a mouse, trackpad, or keyboard, the MPC software was designed to give you access to many of its functions using 16 pads, the buttons, encoders called Q-Links, and now the new touch strip in the case of MPC Studio. It's also in many ways optimized to be used with a touchscreen if you have the MPC-1, MPC Live, Live 2, and MPC-X. But overall, it's the same engine powering the entire family, whether on a computer with a controller or standalone. A lot of this hands-on approach is accomplished by giving these 16 pads many different modes. So yes, you can use them for finger drumming, but they do quite a few other things. So for example, in the case of drum kits, pressing 16 levels gives you much more than just 16 levels. You can play samples chromatically, apply different filtering based on the pad you press, and a bunch of other things, including velocity. Let's use the pads for playing chords. And different progressions. So no need to buy a MIDI chord pack for this. And yeah, there are actually quite a few options here. Notice on screen, you can transpose this up and down, choose different chord packs or different chord options. By the way, all these options are, of course, available on the software. So you can see I can choose the different pad perform layouts and all these options using the mouse, which may be more convenient for cases like these where you have so many options. I have this set up like this, by the way, but it's really convenient to have the screen somehow right here, for example, to see the chord types. So I think you're starting to get the idea. There are plenty of uses for these pads. For example, mutes for different drums in a kit, or mute for different tracks using Shift, track mute. So I could choose to, mute one or more tracks. By the way, you hear the metronome. It's not marked here, but Shift and play start turns off the metronome. And yeah, there's even more. If you notice the markings here, you can travel between different pad modes, which you can do on the screen as well, obviously. So these let you travel through the different modes, but there's no need to use the screen for that. Just hit mode and travel from mode to mode, wave editing mode, list edit, sample edit, program edit. So I think you're starting to get it. A lot of use for these pads. Next sequence that you choose different sequences. And MIDI control lets you use this as a MIDI controller within your DAW. The MPC software, by the way, works both standalone on your computer and as a plugin in your DAW. The final interesting use for the pads is as a step sequencer. So if you don't want to play live and just want to step sequence, hold mode, go into step sequence mode, and yeah, you can add, say, a kick like that, and choose a different pad. Let's maybe go for this one. Sequence this way, as well as play live, of course. Moving on from the pads, the touch strip is a new control element in MPC Studio Mark II, and for the entire MPC line, nothing like this exists in any of the other hardware MPCs, though of course the MPCs with the touchscreen have an XY controller as opposed to a single dimension of control here. And as you can hear, it can do a bunch of things. It has a few modes. In notes mode, it'll play notes. Maybe I'll choose not a drum track, but a melodic track. So it can play notes. And if you hit Shift touch strip, you can configure how it plays those notes. I think this is something that you can only do using the software. So you use this menu to choose scales, velocities, octaves, and so on. It has a few other modes, pitch bend, and mod wheel, which needs to be assigned to something in the patch. Sustain will sustain notes. You can also use it for expression. So then the next touch strip mode is Q-Link. This lets you control the 16 Q-Links based on which Q-Link set you have selected in the software. So right now I'm controlling the bottom left Q-Link, which is oscillator 2 level, which I guess isn't active here. But if I wanted to choose, say, the low pass filter, I could obviously actively choose it this way. But I could also hold this and choose a different Q-Link. Let's say go for amp attack. This one is fairly subtle. So that's how you can hop between the different Q-Links. It isn't as convenient as having knobs, obviously, but this is helpful. In case you want to automate a Q-Link, you choose it and then can automate the parameter using the strip. I won't go over all of these, but let's take a look at a few more. Pad level is a fun one. This lets the touch strip represent the pad level. So let's say if I felt that in the mix this pad was too high, too loud, I could lower it. And you can see the value adjust as I go to different pads. Useful function there. And then another one, here we go, touch effects. So, a few real-time effects based on what I select here. Beat repeats, delay HP, reverse, turntable, wash out. Touch effects are a new kind of insert effect added in this version of the firmware along with MPC Studio Mark II. Cool, think you get the idea. So there are a few of these here. And then one last neat trick that the touch strip has up its sleeve. If you use note repeat mode, you'll see the note repeat frequency here. and you can change it with this nice LED display, and you can use this to perform into the sequence. So the pads and the touch strip are the highlights or the obvious stars of what this has to offer as a controller, but a third important aspect of it are these buttons on the sides. Like I mentioned earlier, it has even more buttons than the MPC-1, which has more buttons than MPC Live. In my opinion, they have even a better look and feel than MPC-1. These were always a bit too clicky in my taste, and these buttons are much more pleasant to press. They're also backlit, so you can easily see what's written on them. These buttons have been added to let you skip around the timeline in different increments or skip to different events. You can also set markers using the locate button. I love this automation read-write indicator with its clear green and red LED. Timing correction and quantization are to be expected, and zoom lets you zoom around the timeline both in and out, and with shift, squish the timeline like this. This works for samples too, so if I go into, say, wave mode, I can zoom in and out just like this. And then brand new and very useful buttons here are sample start and sample end. So you can change that very easily, sample start and end, and sample loop start with shift. And shift will also let you fine tune this. So say if I go to sample start, these are relatively coarse motions, but you can fine tune things with shift. It's also very easy to navigate around tracks and presets. Browse lets you browse around. In this case, I'm browsing through projects. You can't currently select whether you're browsing programs, presets, projects, or sequences using the controller, so you do have to use a mouse for that. But other than that, once you've chosen your category, it's very easy to scroll around. These, again, are super tiny, but I just look at the screen and not at this when it's about selecting from lists. So those are more or less the highlights of MPC Studio Mark II as a controller. If you're familiar with the MPC software, feel free to skip right ahead to the pros and cons or the comparison to Maschine Mikro. Otherwise, let's take a brief look at the software and the overall MPC workflow in the context of the controller and often the software as well. Now, the MPC software, like any DAW, looks intimidating at first. When you first install it, the installer offers to ease the shock a bit by activating a simple mode. I'd recommend not doing that. You could always go back into Workspace and get out of this simple mode. I don't think it's that different. I just go for advanced. I think that it's important to see this stuff here as you learn the software and get your bearings. There are sort of 4 zones. This on the right, typically to browse content. On the left, the channel strips. And in the middle, these swap out based on which mode you're looking at. This more or less takes care of itself. If you just swap out modes using the mode button, the screen will follow whatever you're doing on the controller. I already talked about the browser. You can either view the factory content or any files on your hard drive. The left side also remains more or less static. You can see which sequence you're on in your project. This one has just 1. You can see which tracks you have. This one has 2. And you can see which programs are loaded up into the track, the current active track. Below that, you have effects. There are multiple levels of effects in MPC. It's, again, fairly complex, but you need to get used to it. There are pad effects if you're using a drum kit, then program effects, master effects. The MPC software also supports submixes. Overall, MPC supports 2 types of tracks: MIDI tracks, which hold notes and play plugins or samples, and audio tracks, which just hold samples across the timeline. I'm showing you this using the mouse, by the way, but you could have done pretty much everything using these buttons. So track select lets you choose between audio tracks and MIDI tracks. And as you choose MIDI tracks, you can choose track 1, track 2, and so on. So scroll between the different tracks. You can also jump around tracks by holding main and choosing the track using these pads, track 1, track 2. You get up to 128 MIDI tracks and up to 128 audio tracks when you're using the software on a computer. Audio tracks are relatively simple. There's not much to say about them. You can just drag and drop samples anywhere you want on the timeline, move it around, and zoom in and out, drag more samples onto the timeline. You can record into them. They're just placeholders for audio, basically. MIDI tracks are a little bit more complex because there are 6 types of them. You can choose MIDI track types either by clicking them over here or by choosing Shift and Track Type. Drum tracks let you assign different samples to different pads in up to 8 banks of 16 pads, so 128 different pads or samples per track. Next up are key group track types. These lets you play samples melodically and also hold multi-samples, meaning samples for different regions of the keyboard. So instead of pitching one sample extremely high, which makes it chipmunky, or extremely low, which distorts it, you can have different samples for different keys and recreate naturally sampled instruments this way. If you browse through the factory content, by the way, then if you choose instrument, you'll be able to see all the multi-sample instruments. So say if I wanted a piano, let's go for this one. So this, if we look behind the scenes, is a piano that has a bunch of multi-samples, a bunch of keys that were sampled. And the end result is a very natural sounding instrument, regardless of whether we play it high or low. Back to track types. So key groups and drums are sampled instruments, then plugins are software instruments which may or may not be synthesized or contain samples. Now, unfortunately, you can't choose the plugins using the controller. You'll need to use your mouse for that, and you can select from any number of plugins that come with the MPC software, as well as plugins on your computer. So any software instrument would work in this context. So now we've got a software instrument running here. We can also look at the instrument itself by clicking here. As usual, plugins are a bit of an inconvenience in this respect, but if you choose plugins that come with the MPC, say Hype, then while you can see standalone windows for those as well, you can also see them within the context of the program edit screen here on the bottom, nicely tucked away with all their parameters. Now, while you can't choose the plugin using the MPC controller, you can choose the preset by double tapping Program Select. Again, very small here on screen, but you can if you want to. Let's move on and look at the other track types. Next up are MIDI tracks. These don't play any of the internal plugins. You can use external gear, control external gear with them, sequence synths if you like. Next track type is clip tracks. So these are interesting. So clip tracks let you load up different audio loops into pads, and then those loops can play alongside each other or mute each other if you want. And the nice thing about clips in clip programs is that they sync up to the tempo. So if I tap a slower tempo, they'll time stretch down or up. So those are clip type tracks. And then you've got CV tracks, which aren't relevant for a computer or the MPC Studio Mark II controller. They are when you use MPC hardware that has CV outputs. So those are pretty much the track types. Again, when you dive into each one of the track types, there's a lot going on behind the scenes, which are beyond the scope of this tutorial. So for example, each pad can have multiple layers, which can be velocity layers or just samples that play together. There are, like you see, a bunch of different modulation options here, filtering options, drum effects. These are new for MPC 210. And beyond that, like I mentioned earlier, you can apply effects per pad, per program. And when you click this, you can see both, again, the factory effects, which work on the MPC hardware, as well as any plugin you have installed on your computer if compatibility with standalone hardware isn't important to you. Beyond that, for sampling, sequencing, playing live, Akai have excellent tutorials on their site and in their academy. So let's go ahead and compare MPC Studio Mark II to Maschine Mikro MK3 and talk about pros and cons overall. In terms of competition, while any DAW on your computer is a potential competitor, for a hands-on experience controlling software at this price, the only credible alternative, I think, is the Maschine Mikro MK3. Let me know if you think otherwise in the comment section. There are a few differences on the hardware, software, and content side. On the hardware side, overall, the controllers are almost the same size and both have a very solid build. The pads are a matter of preference. If you like to finger drum with force, you might prefer the MPC pads. Personally, I prefer the lighter feel and sensitivity of the Maschine pads. I'm not much of a finger drummer, but drumming is really only one of the many things you can do on both these controllers. If you have a chance to try them out in person, I highly recommend it. In terms of the touch strip, the MPC strip has the same 4 functions as the Maschine strip: mod, pitch bend, effects, and notes, but goes beyond with the additional functions I mentioned earlier, like the individual parameter controls using Q-links, pad levels, and more. This touch strip has a longer travel distance compared to this one, again a matter of personal preference. In terms of hands-on controls and buttons, MPC Studio has more of them. I particularly like the fact that you can chop samples on the controller using the start, end, and loop start buttons along with a data dial, as opposed to Maschine, which only lets you chop samples using a mouse on the screen. Then when it comes to overall workflow, that too is a matter of personal preference. The MPC workflow is more siloed. For example, the clip launcher programs and looper are their own entities, whereas on Maschine they're all rolled up into the audio plugin. Or in MPC, the drum synths need to be in their own program and samples and plugins can't live together in a kit, whereas in Maschine, each pad in a kit can be anything you want it to be, whether a plugin, sample, or audio loop. All that said, the biggest difference, I think, is how you arrange songs. Both let you chain scenes or sequences into songs, but Maschine lets you reuse the same elements across multiple scenes. So if you make a change in a pattern that appears in multiple parts in your song, it will apply globally across your song, but you have the option not to if you like by turning it into a clip. That in contrast to MPC, where you have to copy and paste track content across sequences every time you want to make a change in a pattern that applies to every place that pattern appears. Maschine also lets you create clips that span across multiple scenes or sequences, whereas in MPC that's not currently possible. It'll be interesting to see how the MPC arranger evolves in light of what we've already seen in Akai's Force, which shares a similar platform but has a more flexible arranger. If you plan to rely on factory expansions as opposed to your own samples, it might make sense to listen to a few expansion demos on both platforms to see which you prefer. Overall, I think Maschine has a broader offering. Another final point for the comparison between the two: if you do eventually plan to disconnect from a computer and work standalone, the step up in price to an MPC-1 is less than the step up in price to a Maschine Plus. And if you do plan to go that route, I made a whole video comparing the two. I'll link to that below. Ultimately, I don't think there's a wrong choice regardless of what you pick, since both platforms are backed by serious companies that seem to be very aware of what the other is doing. You can't really make a wrong choice, and both are playing a game of catch up with each other across different features and functionality. Okay, so that was the comparison to Maschine Mikro MK3. Let's take a look at the pros and cons of MPC Studio Mark II. Overall, on the hardware side, if I had to name my top 3 cons, probably on top would be the fact that 1, the MPC Studio Mark II doesn't have a built-in audio interface. You'll need to get one if you plan to sample or need more I/O than what's on your computer. 2, the lack of the 4 Q-Link knobs. And 3, the small screen. But on the other hand, those 3 things are probably what made it possible to hit the price point that this will be selling at. Of the 3, by the way, what I miss the most are the Q-Link knobs. I think the screen is useful when you look down. Mostly you'll be looking at the screen and sort of typing blind on this. And as far as audio I/O, again, if you're not sampling, you don't really need an audio interface. Consider that if you do want to sample using the MPC Studio. Beside that, I mentioned pad sensitivity. Though it's like this across the MPC range, so at this point it might be just me that prefers a lighter touch. Obviously, people aren't complaining if they keep on making these. Pros on the hardware side is that the build is excellent. This product is extremely well laid out and thought through. It's fun and easy to both get going making music with it, as well as get pretty far along before you have to reach out for a mouse. On the software side, the MPC platform is very mature and feature-rich, and Akai keeps adding substantial new features every firmware update. I already talked about the pros and cons on the arranger side. The only material caveat I can think of currently is that the MPC software doesn't run natively on M1 Macs. This is an old one, though this issue is clearly on Akai's radar. I'll link below to a page where they discuss this topic, and it seems like they're working to solve this problem. Other than that, I think the software is fairly easy to use compared to DAWs once you get used to where things are. So if you want to get going making beats and music on your computer, whether you plan to move to a standalone version later on or not, MPC Studio Mark II is a great way to start as opposed to mousing around a complex DAW user interface. And this particular package bundles a good chunk of factory content to get you going. And when you're ready to start exploring oscillators, LFOs, filters, envelopes, and all the other sound design options available on the MPC platform, check out my ever-expanding book, available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this video was useful. Don't forget to ring the YouTube bell if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.